Just to introduce the recording, this is the showcase for the Oral History Awards of 2024. Welcome everybody, and I'd like to start by welcoming and introducing Jane Josem, who's going to talk about the Melbourne Holocaust Museum exhibition In the Footsteps. So if everybody else could just mute your audio and your video, and I'll switch to speaker view. Thanks, Jane. Over to you.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure and an honour to be here. It's an honour to have been nominated, and an honour to be able to present our project, which, there we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so In the Footsteps. So just to set the scene, the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, which is in Elstonwick, was created over 40 years ago by Holocaust survivors who had migrated to Melbourne. And Holocaust survivor testimony really remains central to the museum, even as fewer and fewer survivors walk among us. So when the curatorial team started working on the new museum exhibition, which is titled Everybody Had a Name, and it opened late 2023. So we wanted to find a way to deal with the fact that there would be fewer survivors talking to visitors in the space itself. When the museum first opened back in 1984, every day survivors greeted the visitors and took them around, and this was recognised as a highlight of the experience, meeting a real eyewitness to history. So as a curatorial team, like how could we ensure that survivor voices were still present in the museum? And how do we assist visitors to, let me get to the next slide. Sorry, hang on, there we go. That's the new museum. So how do we assist visitors to forge a personal connection to the historical events? And how do we do this with care for both the challenging histories that the survivors want to impart and the need to not traumatise our guests? So I want to frame this conceptually with a notion from an article by Jennifer Bonnell and Roger I. Simon, which is titled Difficult Exhibitions and Intimate Encounters. And in this article, they posit first the notion that difficult exhibitions at times tender a burdensome gift, a demanding bequest that contains within it the expectation of an empathic response. And second, the notion of the intimate encounter, an exhibition experience which offers the visitors the potential for insight that may support new ways of relating with and within the world around them. So basically, with this concept in mind, our solution was to create this multimedia overlay interactive for the exhibition, and it's called In the Footsteps. So at the entrance to the exhibition, visitors can select a postcard, one of the 6 postcards that you'll see there, and it features one of 6 survivors, and then they access that survivor's story chronologically through 5 multimedia kiosks in different galleries in the museum. So as the visitor traverses the exhibition space, they walk somewhat in the footsteps of their chosen survivor. The general history is exhibited all around them as they dive into the personal. So the postcards are inserted into the kiosks, and it triggers a 2-minute video combining survivor testimony alongside photos, images of artefacts or archival film footage. The kiosks, as you can see, they're portrait in orientation and designed so that visitors meet the survivors at roughly eye height and roughly life size, although they have in fact turned out to be a bit larger than life. So from most parts of the gallery, the kiosks are actually in your sight line and you see a survivor looking at you, while in rest mode, the screens scroll through large images of the survivors. So In the Footsteps enables visitors to access powerful eyewitness storytelling. So let me give you a taste. So at the first station, each survivor introduces themselves. So this is Willie Lermer.
My name is Willie Lermer, and I'm born in Krakow, Poland. My parents rented a shop which they converted into a kosher coffee lounge. So I was with them, and of course my mother was the chef, and my father was in front in the shop. My parents worked very hard. They used to get up 6 in the morning, and they didn't close the coffee lounge till about 11 because they served breakfast, lunch, dinners, and suppers when people came out from theaters or movies, come in for a bite to eat or have a cup of coffee. Now,
And then,
the only
oops, no, let's not do that. Let's go to the next slide. So the next one is Irma Hanna, who's from Dresden in Germany, and she was around 10 years old when the events she describes occurred, and this is in the second gallery of the museum.
On the bottom of the building, there was an ice dealer, what do you call it, a ice parlor, ice cream parlor. And the man was Italian. And I used to always have ice cream in his place. And one day he said, sorry, but I can't give you any more ice cream. I'm not allowed to sell to Jews ice cream. And he was upset, but he did sell a few times. And they warned him. I felt very angry because I had to wear a star in the daytime too. And sometimes I used to still go to school in 40, 39, 40. Used to walk in the street with a star on Jude. And the children used to bash us, with a stick. And so I protected myself to go out of the building where we lived, which was a working class area, very poor area. I protected myself by covering the star with my satchel for the school.
Oops. So, and visitors can actually retain, they can keep the postcard as a souvenir, as a bit of a reminder, and they can go home and access some of the other testimonies on our website or get the fuller story, because these obviously are only short clips. So in terms of how we chose the survivors, it isn't easy to pick favourites among these incredible survivors. And together with my colleague, Lisa Phillips, who was then head of education, we faced the challenge choosing 3 of each gender and ensuring they were from a range of countries and with quite different experiences. In terms of the source material for the storytelling, the survivors had established a video testimonies project collecting over 1,300 testimonies, varying in length from 1 to 8 hours per survivor. So it's a vital source of detailed information about their Holocaust experiences, which are great for researchers, but the quality is not so good for broadcasting in a museum display. The content itself is often rambling, disjointed, as the survivors themselves are recounting very difficult memories and stories from their past. So it's tricky to edit some of those longer pieces into the bite-sized chunks that you need for these sort of museum displays. But thankfully, a former volunteer and history student, Eileen Wright, wrote her honours thesis in 2001, I should say, at Deakin University about the museum, and she identified the need to focus on dealing with a post-survivor future. And she then worked with others to establish a project called Eyewitness, filming 26 of our survivor guides talking about their experiences as if they were talking to students. These were then edited into shorter presentations for future use by the museum. We used them in our former exhibition. Our education team are now using them for students at times. And this film archive of the pre-edited rushes became the source material for In the Footsteps. Given that these were filmed 20 years ago, this enabled us to include survivors who had already passed away. And as we were creating this with the survivors who are now aged 90 plus, to use testimony that they gave when they were closer to 70 years old, was just more coherent in the way that they articulate their experiences. In terms of how to select the clips, I want to acknowledge the team who agonised over these choices. So Arik Dibble, who was the creative director of multimedia, he had oversight of the whole project, liaising with Sandpit Media, who created the kiosks. But Arik created the storyboards for each survivor and inserted potential clips and other media to include. Then the senior curator, myself, the senior curator, Sandy Saxon, and our assistant curator, Fiona Kelman, contributed as well to the selection of the clips. But the essence of the curatorial challenge was how to best represent each survivor in these five short 2-minute video clips. And as we all know, it's harder to tell a story with fewer words than with more. So at the end of the day, we were limited by the stories that the survivors themselves chose to tell when they were being filmed, how coherently and succinctly they were able to express themselves, other archival material available to illustrate their testimony, and not including details that were too harrowing for visitors, which includes school students. It needs to be understood that in the footsteps is a layer of information in the exhibition cake, if we want to use that metaphor. So each layer contributes something important to the whole. Each complements the other. On its own, it's something special, but it's much, much more sitting contextually within the exhibition space. It's in dialogue with the space, as the survivors themselves have always been. And in terms of the impact, that's what I'll end here on. So firstly, the last encounter the visitor has with their survivor is hearing their sort of heartfelt and mostly positive message for the future about valuing democracy, the dangers of hatred, the importance of respecting all people regardless of their ethnicity or religion. And secondly, they see the survivors as models of resilience, people who experienced the worst of humanity as they've just encountered in their youth, yet stand tall as elders in our community today. And finally, In the Footsteps offers visitors another way into this complex and, multifaceted history. And it provides them with something quite tangible to take away. So going back to that quote from Bonnell and Simon about difficult histories, In the Footsteps enables an intimate encounter with one person's story. Visitors walk a mile in their shoes. I think I got you can't understand someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes. So they walk a mile in their shoes, giving them greater insight into what that might have been like. And in so doing, they receive that burdensome gift, the onus of being a witness to a witness, a demanding bequest that contains within it the expectation of an empathic response. The baton is passed from the survivor to the visitor, and it is then entirely up to the visitor whether they accept it or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jane. If you could unshare your slides so that we've got a few minutes now. That was terrific, Jane. It's really great to hear about the nature of the project. Got a few minutes now for any questions. So if anybody would like to either make a comment or ask a question, you can put your video back on so I can see you. You can either raise your hand literally or use the little reactions tool at the bottom of the screen. Is there anyone who'd like to start by asking or commenting about In the Footsteps? While you're thinking, I was just going to ask Jane, since it started, what have been the challenges for the kiosks?
It's interesting. I was just actually at the museum because the curator from the Sydney Jewish Museum is in town. So I said, oh, great, I'll take you around. So I raced over there and everything was working, which was great because the previous time I visited, there were some out of order signs and, that like, I hate technology. I mean, I love it. We all love it, but we hate it as well because, they don't always work and they don't always work perfectly. So that's probably, that is the biggest challenge. I'm unfortunately, because I left the museum soon after it opened, just due to sheer exhaustion. And I love going back there and walking around, but I haven't had the opportunity as much as I would like to see how visitors are engaging with it and I'm too scared to ask.
Thanks, Jane. Alicia, do you want to just put your video and audio back on and ask your question?
Will do, sure. Thank you, Jane. And my question is, I wondered how the survivors and their families reacted to this new exhibition and, in fact, the whole redevelopment.
If there was one answer,
I know.
it's a very, it's always very mixed. Look, mostly I've experienced positive feedback. Not these survivors, but one of them, which was George Ginsberg, his daughter went through. I was a bit scared, and thankfully I wasn't there that day, but they were blown away. But it is a bit daunting to take the family round when you've created it and you're very worried about how it's going to land with them. And it is always challenging when you're really doing 5 short clips. I mean, Avram Goldberg, who's represented and is still alive and is still active in the museum, and he's 101 years old, right? He's actually not 101, he's 100 and a half, okay? I lie. So he used to say, how can I tell my story in half an hour? You're only giving me half an hour. Or sometimes I'd say, can you just get up and talk for 10 minutes? 10 minutes? You'd be kidding. Like, I can't. So I won't ask him how he feels about 10 minutes or, of his testimony. It is challenging. You're dealing with real people and real stories, and it's never going to be exactly what they want. But then in the same breath, they're very happy that their stories are being shared and that people are coming along to listen to them. Alex.
Oh, hang on, Jane. I think
Yep.
we're going to have to move on, I'm afraid, because we've
Yep.
just about got to time. Maybe hold that question. We might have time at the end.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane. Just to say, when I went to the museum, the sister of one of those 6 narrators was showing one of her younger family members around and playing her sister. It was an extraordinary thing to watch. Very moving. Thanks, Jane. If people could put off there, apart from Riley, I'd like to now introduce Riley Jordan, who was part of a large team that produced the People's Movement, the birth of Selby Community House. And Riley, if you could, if you're ready to share your screen, and I'm going to just switch us to gallery view, speaker view.
We good?
Thank you, Riley.
Great. I'm here to represent the Selby Community House History Project, which consisted of a documentary titled The People's Movement, The Birth of Selby House, produced by Leah Hills and Taji Ulrich, and also a series of 3 episodes of a podcast that I produced titled Voices from the House on the Hill, Stories Celebrating 50 Years of Life at Selby Community House. The documentary covers the inception of the house, Jocelyn Ayton, who was the driving force behind the entire project. She had been living in the early 70s on a kibbutz in Israel. Now, she came back to Australia, came back to the hills, discovered she was pregnant, and realised that the hills had very little in the way of childcare or women being able to connect because of the geography of the hills, dirt roads. Transport was almost non-existent. It was expensive to have a car. So she set about forming children's play groups and starting to snowball that whole movement. She was inspired not only from her travels overseas, but she was inspired by what was going on at the time. So the Whitlam government had just come to power and they had a whole lot of new community programs. There was a lot going on in the world. The world was changing. So she took that concept and she had a fire in her belly, and she drove the whole project along with a number of other women pioneers in the beginning, and the documentary covers that story. It was my job to then come along and produce the podcast to expand on that 50 years of history in about 3 episodes. So my first inclination was to try to cover as many varied aspects of the house I wanted to be able to communicate to someone who had never lived in the hills, had never lived in Australia, to show a picture of what it was actually like, but to give the breadth and the depth of the house. For example, I wanted to interview everyone from people behind the scenes, the coordinators, volunteers, people who facilitated groups, people who went to the groups, women's groups, men's groups. The house was a hub for people to come together who were lonely, people to form relationships. Also, the house had a unique spot in the local community because it was, people could facilitate projects through the house. So, for example, there's a bit of natural bushland around the house, and a fellow called Darcy Duggan, who's a local legend, regenerated that bushland, took all the weeds out, the blackberries, so forth, with a whole group of volunteers over time, over decades. And the house was the epicenter of the coordination of that. So it wasn't just people going to the house went out into the community as well. In terms of getting people to interview, initially it was more about word of mouth. Volunteers like Judy Wolfe, who were working behind the scenes, were giving me some contacts, reaching out to people. And after I had a couple of interviews in the can, I realised that I needed to spread my net a little bit further because there were a few sort of niches that I needed to fill. As a result of that, I actually put together a publicity campaign utilising the local radio station and the local press. I made a radio ad in my recording studio at home, and I did some radio interviews, and there was an article in the local paper. As a result of that, we had a number of people come forward, which is fabulous because going back 50 years, memories are rather fragile. But lucky for me, Lynette Forrest came forward. Now, I knew Lynette previously from going to the house because I am a long-time participant of the house myself. She has a vast experience of the house on all levels over 40 years. So she was the perfect interview, the second part of the first episode, to really encapsulate a story arc of what the house was really about. And she came to the interview naturally with a lot of notes. And I'd like now to play for you a short snippet of her interview where she talks about a 40th birthday party that she hired the house for, and she fell through the floor. So let's hear a little bit about that now.
I hired it for my 40th birthday party, and I fell through the floor and had to be sawn out of the balcony. That's my most memorable night at Selby House. Luckily, I had a friend who was a builder, and she had a saw in her car, and I had to be sawn out in full harem gear for my 40th birthday party.
In terms of the parameters for actually recording the interview, I very strongly wanted people to come to my home recording studio. The main reason why is the benefit of being able to record on a nice microphone where you can capture the warmth of a voice, you can capture the vulnerability of a voice. And I had no objection to recording over the phone, but if at all possible, I really wanted people to come. It presents its own problems because obviously people are very shy of confronting a microphone. So there was a little bit of argy-bargy with positioning the mic slightly out of people's line of sight, maybe have them looking out the window, something like that, for people who were particularly shy. However, in one case, there was one interview that I really, really wanted to do with a marvellous raconteur by the name of Jan Wozicki. The only thing was that he was living in Castlemaine. and I really didn't want to do a phone interview. He has a wonderful voice. So what I did is I packed up the studio and we drove, my partner and I, all the way to Castlemaine. I put the studio together there. We spent an afternoon recording his interview, and we pulled it all down and came home again. His project was about a booklet that he had produced through Selby House. While it wasn't done on site, that was actually an oral history project, and he had gone out into the community and recorded stories of people from the very early days of the hills. I'm talking horse and cart era. And he'd come back. Now, the house was connected in here because it funded the project, it coordinated the project, and it published the book. I'd now like to play for you a little video snippet of Jan telling a part of a story of one of the people, one who participated in that. And there's some images there too for some images of the session.
Initial recording sessions, went back if there was, I thought, holes in the story, that sort of thing. So I went back and talked to them again. There was one fella there, Alan. He was almost the youngest and the most fragile in the place. He was about 50, told this story to me about how he'd never had sex, ever. And about how the girls in this town he grew up in, Gurgari, had known this, and how they'd sort of assigned one to sort of seduce him, as he put it, and then get him to the point where, oh my God, this is going to happen, and then walked out on him, and they all giggled and laughed at him. And so when he came out with this, telling such a vulnerable story, and he said, I've never told anybody before, one of the things you had to do was go back and say, Alan, you've suffered greatly from this. You've never told anybody before. Do you really want it in the book? Because I didn't want anybody coming back at him and belittling him over it. And it didn't happen, but he did say, no, I've told that story and I want it to be there.
Just to say, Riley, another minute or so.
Okay. Speaking of oral history, I had a little bit of luck. In the second episode, there's a whole section on the Selby Folk Club, which worked out of the house. And a friend of mine, Dave Miller, who's been a volunteer there for 30 years, he seemed to recall that he had a box of tapes in the attic somewhere with possibly an interview of on tape of one of the very first radio shows that was put out for the Selby Folk Club, which ran out of the house. And I'd like to play that for you now.
My name's Robert Freethy, and I'm bringing you 2 hours of folk music around the hills and Melbourne on the Mountain District Radio. And I'm going to be playing some folk music, mostly of local artists around the hills, around Belgrave and Cockatoo areas. And also I'll be playing some songs from folk singers and songwriters from Melbourne. This is all tied in with a folk club that is held regularly here in the hills at Selby Community House.
So, in summary, when all of that was put together, I was able to edit it in the studio and put it into the format and send it off to the greater world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Riley. That's terrific. I'll just change us back to gallery view. And just while everyone's thinking about any questions or comments you'd like to make to Riley, I just want to highlight that the Selby project produced a wonderful film and a website, an extraordinary collection of photos. So do have a look at the link and watch the film, as well as listening to Riley's podcast. So open up to anybody who'd like to ask any questions or make any comments, including some of the people who are here from Selby Community House. Judy.
Judy here. Thank you, Riley. That was terrific. Alistair, this is a more general question. The podcasts and the film can be accessed through a link on the website of Selby Community House, which troubles me a little because that's not a terribly solid source of information. Alistair, you might have spoken about public, not public lending, right? Legal deposit of items, which applies to printed works. You deposit one copy of your published work with the National Library. But for digital works, there appears to be no such equivalent. If that YouTube channel that hosts these items disappears for whatever reason, where do the products go? Where can they be accessed? And this really troubles me.
I mean, I can just come in quickly on that, Judy. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's true of oral history interviews generally, and it's true of many of the digital multimedia things we make with interviews. I mean, in your case, I would say contact the State Library Victoria as soon as possible and ask them to keep a copy of both the film and the podcasts and ideally the photographs. And possibly also that there are ways of archiving websites as well. So I would definitely suggest you do that and also look at the interviews that were conducted by Riley or your filmmakers and think about depositing those as well. So I would have a discussion with colleagues at the State Library. I can contact you later with emails about preserving them, because you're right. If you leave something on YouTube, eventually it will die, and that would be a terrible shame. Jen, you wanted to ask something?
Well, I just also wanted to chime in and say that you may well be aware of this, Riley, but there's the Victorian Collections site, which offers a digital repository for community groups. So I absolutely agree with Al. I think your material would be probably of real interest to the State Library, but that can be a slow process. And in the meantime, you might find that that's a useful resource.
Thank you.
Anyone else? We've just about got to move on, but is any other quick question or comment? Okay, look, thanks so much, Riley, and thanks also, Judy, for coming along. I mean, I loved when I watched this website and then the film and the podcast and looked at the photos. I really loved it. I just thought, wow. And I thought it was such an important history of such an important period in Australian history. So thanks very much. Next up, I'd like to welcome Alex Watkins, who's going to talk about the Remembering Ash Wednesday website that he produced in collaboration. And Alex will talk more about that. So again, if you could just mute your video and audio, and over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Alistair. G'day, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm stoked to be associated with these different projects. And at the start of the call, I got lumped in to a descriptor as an oral historian for the first time in my life. So it's been a ride recording this oral history of Ash Wednesday and a privilege. I'd just like to take a few minutes to make some comments about the project, and then I'll let the voices that I recorded themselves speak for themselves, and I'll play a short presentation. In late 2022, I was commissioned to record an oral history to mark the 40th anniversary of the Ash Wednesday bushfires of 1983. The Aries Inlet District Association identified that there had been no formal attempt to record a history of the experience of the fires here in Aries Inlet, where I live now, an area which was largely decimated with the loss of 2 lives and over 500 houses. I interviewed a variety of people who could all provide accounts of the fire, and not necessarily all first-hand accounts facing the fire itself. It could be people who owned holiday homes or came and witnessed the aftermath or the recovery. but they all had an account of the impact of the fire on the local district. That included CFA crew, to the local publican, to a well-known news anchor, to an ecologist studying local fauna before and after the fire, to a man employed in the aftermath to track down and kill maimed wildlife and livestock in the Otways and hinterland. So we ended up with 30 speakers across 26 interviews, because some of the interviews were recorded as couples. The presentation of the project was always a really important part of it for me. In common with Riley, who spoke before me, the audio quality was really crucial, in my opinion, because I think it captures the texture of people's voices and characters, and especially with this really emotional content, I think hearing the minute kind of qualities in someone's voice is super powerful. But unlike Riley, I recorded all of the interviews in people's homes. Some of them were in Aries Inlet, so that was easy for me. Others in the hinterland, surrounding towns, and a few of them in Melbourne. So given the kind of personal nature and often the lingering trauma in some cases of people's accounts, I think being in people's homes was really important to put them at ease. The project was presented digitally on a purpose-built website. I'll bring that up now, if I can work it out. So this was the presentation, the homepage of the website. It's really important to me that public could have access to the stories relatively unabridged by editing. It became obvious really early on that the power of the stories and the voices, as I've mentioned, could stand alone. And I didn't feel that we needed to distract too much from those subjective accounts. So when you scroll down on the homepage, you can get some information, some context for the project itself. And then we begin to see these portraits of respondents and interviewees. One of the challenges in keeping actually in common with the Holocaust Museum project was being able to give audiences an entree into the stories without having to make everyone trawl through hours and hours of interviews. So I managed to output short excerpts from each respondent, which acted as little sound bites to hopefully encourage browsers to hook them in and get them to engage more deeply by clicking through. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear this, but if I hover, did you hear that? So
no, we didn't hear that, Alex, but that's okay.
Okay, hopefully it works better when I share my video, but short excerpts across all of these individuals and couples, and then also a gallery component, a visual component with photography taken in 1983 by people who witnessed the fire. So yeah, it was a real ride going to people's homes and being given the privilege to kind of for people to open up to a stranger like that. I thought was an amazing process. In terms of my approach, the two main lines of inquiry were the way Ash Wednesday affected the natural and built environment within the district and also the social impact of the fire. We covered the summer leading up to February 16th, 1983. We covered the day itself, the aftermath and the recovery. But I was conscious to try to keep the structure fairly elastic to remain open to the meandering patterns of people's memories. Overall, I found that learnings from the stories remain remarkably current today. Accounts from 1983 regularly segued into current political views around fuel reduction works, bushfire management overlays, major emergency planning, and more generally, the precarious place that human habitation has in this landscape during an era of climate change. But most of all, it was the intimacy and immediacy and the personal nature of many of the accounts that struck me. For many people who I interviewed, the memories are still raw. And for some, it was actually the first time they'd spoken of the event to anybody. So yeah, fascinating process. A quick thank you to Aries Inlet District Association and Peter McPhee and Charlotte Allen, who are on the call, who are sounding boards throughout, and of course all the participants. I'm going to play a short, it's not that short, hopefully we've got time. It's a 5-minute video. Most of this time the screen will be black. Alistair, if you can't hear anything, then let me know and I'll try and...
Sure.
I'm going to stop sharing and...
we may not have time to play it all.
Okay,
it's okay.
That's fine. Just yell out.
2 or 3 minutes, maybe.
Okay, that's fine.
I joined the Aries Inlet Fire Brigade in 1979, and leading up into Ash Wednesday, I'd been to a number of fires along the coast, very small fires in comparison to Ash Wednesday. Nothing would have given me the training or the experience of what I was sort of faced with during Ash Wednesday.
There was a sort of a sense of trepidation that summer, particularly because of the heat, the lack of rain, not because of the fire threat so much as I think because of the big dust storm. Everyone then, I think, in Victoria realised that something very strange is going on.
And it was horrendous the day, you know, and I'd said to him, I don't want to hear the fire siren today. With this north wind that we've got, it is a horror.
And I walked out of the house over in Burson Street and looked up at the sky and thought, oh, there's a cool change coming. And I looked up properly the second time, not just a glance, and went, oh, shit.
When the wind changed, it come straight at us. It was over from Dean's Marsh over the back there. When it hit Lawn and it turned into a westerly, we've got a 35 to 40k fire front, what we've got to fire.
I said to the guys, if any of you feel like not going any further, we're not going. I didn't know what we're getting into. I knew at that stage it had taken off and we were driving into it.
When it came into town, it came in like the air show was on, but it was coming up the valley here. You just hear...
It was just a huge roar, the movement of ash and embers through the air around us and just the amount of wind and the vehicles just shaking and rocking.
Birds flying along that were catching on fire, like it was like just birds just falling out of the sky.
We had, CFA overalls on, boots and everything, got into the water and we were just ducking under the water, ducking sheets of iron and stuff as it landed around us.
Houses blew away before the flames got to them. That's how hard the wind was. Serious stuff, but I can't even comprehend what happened.
Okay, and the story goes on, obviously. So that was some of the voices that we were privileged enough to record.
Thanks so much, Alex. I'll just shift us back to gallery view. I've got a few minutes again for question and comments, and just so good to hear that audio, and your points, the quality of the audio, and be able to hear the meaning in voice is so rings so true when you listen. So yeah, anybody want to ask any questions or make any comments about? Yeah, Riley.
I wanted to ask, because this subject matter is so intensely traumatic, did you have any techniques or things that you would do to give people a breather, or how did you approach it? Because it's just not straightforward. Even contacting them for the first time, what did you use to try to sort of get them on side, get them out of their shell?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. The first point would be that they generally approached us. So there was a pretty significant reach out in terms of what the project was about, and then people were encouraged to come to us. So they already had a level of keenness to get involved, but it was difficult at different times. And I think being obviously being in their home was great. I think for the most part, sitting down and having a coffee and not having any time constraints,
Yeah.
maybe even 20, 30 minutes of hanging out before there's a microphone could be really helpful. And then obviously when people broke down, rather than, and the kind of filmmaker side of me, rather than intervene and stop everything, I would let things run, but give people the time they required. And if they needed to step out, they could.
Yeah.
Thanks. Peter, you wanted to come in.
Oh, just to make the point that one of the things that I find most accessible about what Alex has done is the way that he's made the news searchable by theme.
Peter, you're just breaking up. You were clear when you started. Do you want to just move a bit closer to your mic?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just on my phone. No, it's the way he's made the interviews accessible by theme, so you don't have to listen to the entire interview. You can actually interrogate and investigate what's particular interest in you. And I think, I find that particularly engaging about the project.
Thanks. I think in case people couldn't hear that, basically one of the great things about this website is you can follow an individual story, but you can also follow a theme and hear different people's stories about that theme. And yes, I agree, that works very effectively. Anyone else want to come in? Can't see any hands up. Look, again, I just want to say thanks. Thanks, Alex. Alicia, do you want to? Yeah. Alicia?
Oh, thanks, Al, and thanks, Alex, and everybody. My question is, and we spoke a little bit about this at the award ceremony, Alex, just about, the people who weren't able to tell their story, and you had some reflections, I think, about maybe those who left and weren't part of the community, and what you hope this project will do in terms of people telling stories that perhaps they haven't told before.
Yeah, I can't remember what I said, Alicia, because I was about 5 scones in, but I think picking up on the second part of the question, I found it amazing what happens when you give people an opportunity to sit down and tell their story in a safe environment and show someone showing interest in their story. And the most affecting cases were when people had never had the opportunity or they hadn't done that. And there was one Vietnam vet who ended up talking and tying the trauma of his Ash Wednesday to his experience in Vietnam. And it was clear that it was part of a much bigger, psychological beast in his life, which has never left him. And it's very powerful when people feel kind of liberated enough to share and be honest. And there's actually a host of examples of people saying stuff they had never told people, which was fascinating. It made me think that this type of project, particularly when there's trauma and difficult emotions involved, it obviously works from a narrative point of view, I believe, but also it's so important for small communities and individuals to be given that opportunity to share.
Such a great point, Alex. We'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for coming and telling us a bit about the project. Again, I'd urge everyone to have a look at that website. It's just stunning. So let me finally introduce Alex Pierce. Alex produced the podcast Women, Conscription, War. It actually won the award, but I actually reckon all 4 of these could have won it. Alex, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I hope that sounds all right. Let me share my screen. There we go. So firstly, I want to say thanks to the judges for the immense honour of winning this amazing category. All of the other podcasts have also been just incredible. I think you're all brilliant. So I spent about 4 years interviewing women who lived in Melbourne and protested against the Vietnam War and the National Service Act. I interviewed about 57 women in the end. I also did a bunch of archival research to support that information that I found. And I spent about a year also putting it together as a podcast. For most of that time, I was also working as a high school history teacher. So I initially wasn't going to make a podcast. Unlike the other presenters, initially I was just looking to get some resources for my students. and then looking to record some stories that I didn't think had been told or recorded particularly in an accessible format. Then things got a bit out of hand. I'd done a whole bunch of research and I realized that I had an enormous amount of information and it really needed to be put together in some way and hopefully create a cohesive whole. So the end result is a 15-episode audio documentary, including episodes about 3 university campuses. Actually, Monash gets 2 episodes because they had some really very radical students. There's an episode about women who assisted draft resistors and a whole bunch of other topics as well. The fact that I hadn't really planned on making a podcast means that the quality of the interviews is a bit variable. I did some interviews in person, but also a lot of them happened during the Melbourne lockdowns. So I did a lot of Zoom and Skype and FaceTime. And bizarrely, actually, the lockdowns were kind of useful for me. A lot of the women I was speaking to, well, all of them were at least in their 70s, if not in their 80s. And there are a lot of women that I contacted who said, oh, yeah, I know how to use FaceTime. That's fine, because they'd only started using it quite recently. I should also say at this point that the research had, I guess, an additional layer for me. My dad was a NASHO, a national serviceman, and he'd been involved heavily in the veteran community before he died, which is many years ago now. And my mum is actually still very involved in the Legacy Club of South Australia. She was their first female president a few years ago. She's back on the board now as the vice president and the chair of the board. So I grew up knowing quite a bit about the Vietnam War and absolutely nothing about the protests. I want to share just a couple of the remarkable things that I learned through the process, and I'll play a few clips to illustrate this too. So on the screen, you've got my website, Women Conscription War, which I set up to go along with the podcast. So firstly, I wanted to talk about the motivations for the women who got involved. They were really varied, which was something that I kind of hadn't expected. I spoke to women who were committed Christians, who were therefore against any killing, and I spoke to women who were pacifists, but not for religious reasons, and I spoke to women who were committed communists, who really wanted North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front to win. I also spoke to women who were very angry at Australia, following wherever America would lead. I want to play a short clip that highlights some of this variety. The first voice you'll hear is Andra Jackson, and the second is Janet McCalman.
I thought the French had been in there, and I thought they were a colonialist power, and I felt that America had then stepped in and carried on exactly the same relationship of oppression with the Vietnamese people. I felt that it was a struggle for independence, that America shouldn't have been there and that we shouldn't have joined in. I couldn't see, at that stage, Vietnam was a country that we'd hardly ever heard of. Maybe that was the first time I'd heard of it in connection with the war. So I couldn't see why we would be there.
What sorts of things were your parents discussing or was being discussed around the dinner table about the Vietnam War?
I mean, I just think they saw it as the hot part of the Cold War of the West and capitalism trying to suppress national liberation and a communist movement. So I wanted the North Vietnamese to win.
Secondly, one of the amazing things that I discovered was just the sheer variety of actions that women undertook as part of their protests. So women were physically involved in making the pamphlets and handing them out about both resisting conscription and the war itself. Women sat down on the road in front of barracks in Melbourne and in Sydney. Like, they travelled to Sydney in order to do that. They sat down on train tracks in protest about conscientious objectors who were being taken to jail. They wrote and sang songs. They turned up in miniskirts and matching cloaks at the Melbourne Cup. The back of the cloaks read, "Gamble on horses, not on lives." They got fined, they got arrested, they went to jail. And they also protested at other large gatherings. And I want to play you a clip now from Joan Coxsedge, who was a member of Save Our Sons and also went on to be a politician in Victoria.
One of the things that I have never forgotten, you might have heard about this, was our demonstration against Billy Graham. God, well, it was only a handful of us that turned up. Most of them wouldn't have a vote. There was a hardcore of us, if you like. I think that you have to admit there was a hardcore, and I was in that, of course. And he had a crusade held at the Myer Music Bowl. We thought, well, he was very close to Richard Nixon, very pro-war, fair target, we'll have a go. And then, of course, to do that, we met in St Kilda Road. I remember that, feeling fairly apprehensive. And we had our placards, and we marched, and they were all praying or doing something, I can't remember really, but I think they were all praying. He was up there on the stage going for his life, as Billy Graham does, because I can't stand the man, but anyway, that's beside the point. We walked up behind him and held up our placards. Nobody said a word. Not a sound was said. He ignored us completely. You could have heard a pin drop, and we were just holding up these things behind him. It didn't move a muscle. Not a muscle. And so we just stood there for a while, and then we quietly filed out again and stood there at the back and waited till they all came out, and then some of them...
So, yeah, that was Joan Coxsedge at Billy Graham's crusade. So just to finish up, one of the more remarkable things, and something that all of the women I spoke to was involved in, was the first moratorium on the 8th of May 1970. The moratorium's theme was Stop Work to Stop the War. And I think something that we often forget or simply don't know about was the amazement and joy that was felt by the people involved when tens of thousands of people turned up for that moratorium. I spoke to Sandra Goldbloom-Zerbo, whose father was Sam Goldbloom, who was one of the key organisers of the moratorium, but also the whole anti-Vietnam War campaign in Melbourne. And she remembered that he was rubbished when he suggested that there might be 40,000 people on the street. Oh, Sam, don't be ridiculous. And in the end, most people today would say there were somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people. So Sandra remembered her dad being completely over the moon about that. So just to finish, a really short clip from Carol Goldson reflecting on how she felt when she turned up on the day.
But they were usually pretty low-key, pretty small affairs. That moratorium, that first one, was fantastic. Just the numbers and the variety of people that were present. It wasn't just young people, and it wasn't just left-wing people, and it wasn't just working class people. There were all sorts. It really did feel like being, part of a mass movement, and that was pretty rare. All the campaigns that I'd been involved in previously, they'd all been sort of a bit very minority sort of things.
So Carol's excitement and really joy about having so many different sorts of people turn up is indicative of the attitudes of most of the women that I spoke to, particularly about that particular day and the momentum that the protest movement had gained over the last few years. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much. I'll bring us back to gallery. By all means, put your videos back on if you'd like. Thanks so much, Alex. We've again got a few minutes now before we finish for any questions or comments to Alex about her oral history podcast. And I guess I might just chip in with an opening question, Alex. For you, what were the pros and cons of making a podcast as opposed to the other ways in which you could have used these oral histories?
I had already made a couple of podcasts, so I was somewhat comfortable with the idea of putting things together in that way. So it kind of made sense. I guess I didn't really actually consider alternatives because the voices of the women was so, to me, so thrilling. An 80-year-old woman taking a drag on a cigarette saying, "Now the third time that I was arrested." There's just nothing that beats hearing that. So what I really wanted to do is actually let somebody else, let other people hear those voices and hear the and then we put a pamphlet in the American ambassador's mailbox or whatever it was. Yeah, so that was the real draw card for me.
Thanks. Alex.
Yeah, it's a great project, Alex. Thanks for sharing. Just wondering, did you feel that the women you interviewed demonstrated a kind of lifelong activism against other wars? I know that when we met, we discussed briefly the Iraq protests in the early 2000s. Was it kind of something which set them off on a lifelong journey of intervening in that way?
Yes, for some of them, absolutely. So some of the key figures in Save Our Sons, for instance, have gone on to be activists against, nuclear in all its different variations. Many of them involved in protesting the various other wars that Australia's been involved in, those sorts of things. Many of the women I spoke to, so I started in 2018 and went through into about 2023. So there were a lot of kind of side comments about, just like America's doing at the moment, those sorts of things. So most of the women I spoke to are still very aware, still very angry about a lot of attitudes and issues. Some of them are involved in, grandmas for refugees, those sorts of things. So yes, is the short answer. Absolutely.
Anyone else? Yes, Riley.
Wonderful project. I love the texture of the voices. When you were putting it together, what was your decision making on choosing what to put in what order? Was there anything that you left out, and why?
There was heaps that I left out because I knew, as someone who listens to podcasts myself, they needed to be short-ish episodes. I think my longest episode's 40 minutes, and that's the moratorium one, because I really wanted to get lots of perspectives in there. I tried to make them feel as coherent and cohesive as sort of standalone chapters, basically. That is how I approached it. I do have one that's kind of a misc and other chapter, because things that just didn't fit out anywhere else. I ended up leaving things out when I felt like it was getting too repetitive, and repetitive in a not useful way. Sometimes I left a couple of interviews out completely because the sound quality was terrible, because I didn't know what I was doing at the start, because I didn't even realize I was doing oral history when I started doing these interviews. I just thought I was recording some interesting stories. Yeah, so sometimes quality issues, sometimes repetition. Sometimes I just couldn't figure out a way to write the narration that would allow it to fit together coherently.
Great. Anyone else? Jane.
Look, not a question, but I just wanted to thank you. I can only imagine how hard it's been. It's been a long road, and it's just, I really enjoyed. I haven't finished, but I've really enjoyed listening to the episodes I've listened to. Great. It's great to capture this sort of underrepresented history, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, look, we've gone a bit over time, which is fun, and I just want to close up by thanking in particular Jane and Riley, Alex and Alex, but also the teams behind you. I know, Alex Pierce, yours was mostly a solo effort, but there were big teams behind and communities involved, and the value of this, listening to you all speak and showing some of your material and playing it, you just realize A, how much work it was, B, how thoughtfully you all engage with different communities and individuals, and C, just how you produced wonderful ways of showing how powerful and engaging and transformative both playing and listening to and hearing people's stories can be. So I want to thank you, the four of you. As I said, we've recorded this session, and a lot more people will be able to listen to you once we get the recording up on the website. So Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now.